Marco's earliest memories were filled with uncertainty and shadows, softened only by his connection to his younger sister, Alina. Since he could remember, they had called the orphanage their home, its halls filled with the murmurs of other children, the rustling of caregiver aprons, and the constant echoes of clattering dishes. Yet Marco often felt a world apart, as if something essential lay just beyond his reach, something he had once known but could no longer touch. In rare moments of solitude, Marco's mind drifted back to a vague image of a place that felt like home. He would sometimes catch flashes of a grand house in his dreams, a house full of light, with elegant, sweeping paintings that seemed to gaze down at him with gentle familiarity. Most vividly, he remembered a piano, shining and magnificent, with keys so perfectly white that they seemed to hold secrets of their own. He could recall only the faintest sounds, notes that lingered like wisps of melody, but they filled him with a strange comfort. When he spoke to the caregivers about these dreams, they only chuckled at what they called his fancies. "An imagination is good, Marco, but we're not born into mansions, you know," his favorite caretaker, Sophia, would say with a fond smile. "None of the children here came from such places." The other children would tease him for his talk of the mysterious house. To most of them, Marco was a quiet boy who looked out of place, a little too thoughtful and a bit too mysterious for his own good. But Marco would only sigh and brush off their words. The image of that house stayed with him, lingering like a distant tune in the back of his mind. Then there was Alina, his younger sister, who remained his closest companion through everything. She was small and shy, with eyes that seemed to sparkle whenever she looked at him. She relied on Marco for everything: comfort, company, and the quiet reassurance that they were not alone. He would often sit with her by the window, telling her fairy tales he didn't even remember where he'd heard, softening the hardships of their life with the stories he created just for her. When Marco and Alina first arrived at the orphanage, Marco had one peculiar item in his possession: an old, slightly worn black violin case. It was the only piece of his past that he could remember, and he held onto it with a fierce grip, unwilling to let anyone else touch it. The caregivers had tried to take the case from him at first, but his desperate tears had stopped them. The violin was his anchor, the last thread connecting him to whatever life had come before. The violin itself was nothing extraordinary to look at. Its wood was plain, and the strings slightly worn. But the moment Marco placed the instrument beneath his chin and drew the bow across the strings, a transformation seemed to take place. With each note, a world opened up, a world that was vibrant, beautiful, and filled with an unexplainable nostalgia. The first time he played, it was like something deep within him unlocked. The melodies that came from his violin were haunting and filled with longing. Sophia, who was often his listener, was astounded by how beautifully and soulfully he played, despite his young age. The tune was unlike anything she had heard from a child. She would sometimes sit by the doorway, listening with her eyes closed, moved by the unspoken words hidden in each note. "Marco, who taught you to play like this?" she asked him one evening after he had finished a particularly mournful melody. He glanced at her, uncertainty clouding his eyes. I don't know," he admitted. It was true. He couldn't recall ever learning the violin, nor could he remember anyone teaching him. But when he played, the music flowed from him as naturally as if it were part of him, as if the violin and he had been companions forever. Each night, as the other children readied for bed, Marco would slip quietly into a corner of the common room and play his violin. The music became his way of communicating feelings he couldn't otherwise express: the loneliness, the lingering sadness of an unknown loss, and an inexplicable small hope that maybe, somewhere out there, someone was looking for him and Alina. Over time, Marco's playing became a ritual, a quiet gift he offered to the orphanage each evening. Many of the caregivers found themselves drawn to his music, wiping away tears they didn't even realize they'd shed. Some of the children mocked him, calling him Fancy Marco or Prince Violin, and others would sneer that he was putting on airs. Despite their words, no one could deny the way his music filled the halls, bringing a warmth that soothed everyone within earshot. There was, however, one child in particular, a boy named Andre, who couldn't stand the attention Marco received. Andre was tall and boisterous, known among the children for his quick temper and his tendency to get his way. He found Marco's quiet ways and the reverence others showed him grating. To Andre, Marco was little more than a show-off, someone who used his music to set himself apart. One evening, when Marco returned to his room after playing, he found the violin case missing. Panic surged through him as he searched every corner, heart pounding as he checked and rechecked every possible hiding place. Just as he was beginning to despair, he heard muffled laughter from down the hallway. In a burst of fury, Marco sprinted toward the sound, his heart aching with both anger and fear. In the common area, Andre was standing with the violin, holding it by the neck as if it were some ordinary toy. He smirked when he saw Marco's frantic expression. "Looking for this, fancy Marco?" Andre taunted, holding the violin just out of reach. "Give it back!" Marco's voice trembled, not with fear but with a raw, simmering anger he didn't even know he could feel. He lunged for the violin, but Andre only laughed, pulling it further away. "Why should I? Do you think you're special just because you have this silly old violin?" Andre sneered. That was the moment something inside Marco snapped. He grabbed a nearby pillow and flung it at Andre with surprising force, startling the other boy. Caught off guard, Andre dropped the violin in surprise. It clattered to the floor and Marco quickly scooped it up, clutching it protectively to his chest. Caregivers had come running at the noise, and Sophia, who had always understood the importance of the violin to Marco, took one look at the situation and immediately scolded Andre for his behavior. She guided Marco away, comforting him and assuring him that no one would take his violin from him again. After that night, the teasing faded and a fragile peace settled over Marco's life in the orphanage. With his violin safe in his room, he continued his evening performances, filling the halls with music that, while sad, seemed to comfort everyone who heard it. His playing was not just an expression of his own emotions, but a gift to those around him, a reminder of something deep and beautiful beyond the orphanage walls. To Marco, the violin was more than an instrument. It was a whisper of his past, a song of memories just out of reach. And in its familiar strings and notes, he found solace, a sense of home that he shared only with Alina, the one person in the world who understood him completely. As he played, he wondered if someday, somewhere, he would finally find the answers to the questions that haunted his dreams. The first few months in the orphanage were challenging for Marco and Alina, as they adapted to routines and a life vastly different from whatever past they might have had. For Marco, the adjustment was a quiet one. He slipped into the rhythm of the orphanage's daily life, observing more than speaking, often withdrawing into his thoughts. The other children mostly left him alone, although there were occasional challenges, like the incident with Andre. But Marco learned to navigate these encounters with a quiet resilience, keeping his violin close and his emotions closer. Alina, on the other hand, struggled more openly. At only 4 years old, she was fragile and often overwhelmed. She missed her brother whenever he was out of her sight and clung to him whenever he was near, her small hand always reaching for his. Her shyness and natural reserve made it difficult for her to make friends, and the teasing of the other children often brought her to tears. Marco would comfort her as best as he could, whispering stories and promises to keep her spirits up. The caregivers noticed the bond between them and occasionally allowed exceptions to the rules, such as letting Marco sit with Alina in her dormitory until she fell asleep, or allowing her to sit quietly by his side while he played his violin in the evenings. These quiet moments became the sibling sanctuary, a time when they could escape the world of the orphanage and find solace in each other's company. Over time, Marco found his place in the orphanage. He took on small tasks, helping the caregivers with chores like tidying up, folding laundry, or reading to the younger children. His music brought comfort to many, even if he didn't realize it himself. Sophia, the gentle and understanding caregiver who had become a steady presence in his life, would sit with him after his evening performances and ask him about his day or tell him stories from her own life, filling in the silence he was so accustomed to. But even as he adjusted, Marco never felt fully settled. He felt like he was waiting for something, though what that was he couldn't say. His past remained an elusive dream, fragments of which would come to him at the strangest times. A flash of color, a faint scent, the sensation of soft carpet under his feet. Each time the memories seemed close, yet forever out of reach. Through it all, Marco felt the weight of responsibility for Alina. He knew that he was all she had, just as she was all he had, and he was determined to protect her and ensure that she didn't feel alone in this vast, uncertain world. One cold winter evening, Marco sat by the small window in the children's playroom, watching as soft snowflakes drifted down from the sky. Alina sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. She seemed more subdued than usual, her brow furrowed as she gazed out into the snowy night. "Do you think we'll always be here, Marco?" she asked quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Marco's heart ached at the question. He had been wondering the same thing himself, but had never dared to voice it aloud. Turning to her, he gave a small, reassuring smile. "No, Alina. We won't always be here. One day we'll leave and start a new life, just the two of us." Alina looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with worry and hope. "But what if no one comes for us? What if we're here forever?" In that moment, Marco realized how much the fear of abandonment haunted his sister. While he had learned to accept their circumstances with a quiet resilience, Alina struggled with a constant sense of longing. She missed the love and security they'd lost, even if she could no longer remember where it had come from. Marco took her small hands in his gaze steady. "If no one comes for us, then I'll take care of you myself. I'll work, find us a home, and we'll live together, just like a family. I promise you, Alina, you'll never be alone." She looked up at him with a mixture of relief and sadness. "But Marco, that's still a long time. You won't be 18 for so many years." "I know," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "But we'll be patient. We'll wait, and we'll find our way out together. Just hold on a little longer." Alina nodded, her fears momentarily soothed. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his presence. After a long pause, she looked up at him again. Do you think someone in the world loves us?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Marco's chest tightened at the question. He wanted so badly to give her an answer that would comfort her, something that would erase her fears. But he knew he couldn't lie to her, so he chose his words carefully. "I believe someone did once," he said softly. "And maybe, in some way, they still do. Maybe they're watching over us, even if they can't be here right now." Alina seemed to find a small comfort in this thought. She closed her eyes as if imagining a presence beside them, someone who loved and protected them from afar. Marco knew that in reality, they were alone in the world, but he would hold on to his promise for her sake. He would be both protector and friend, the one person she could always depend on. As the days turned into weeks and the winter dragged on, Alina's struggles continued. The other children could be unkind, often teasing her for her quiet demeanor and timid ways. She would sometimes come to Marco with tear-streaked cheeks, her plush rabbit clutched tightly in her arms, and he would hold her until her sobs faded. One afternoon, she ran to him, visibly shaken, her hands clutching at the worn fabric of her dress. She had been taunted by a group of girls who mocked her curls, her small freckles, and her timid nature. The words had hurt her deeply, and she was desperate to leave the orphanage and escape their constant jeers. "Marco, please, can't we leave now? Can't we run away?" she begged, her voice thick with desperation. Marco's heart broke as he listened to her pleas. He wanted nothing more than to take her away, to find a safe place where they could live in peace. But he knew it wasn't that simple. The world outside was vast and unknown, and they were just children with nowhere to go. He knelt down beside her, gently brushing a stray curl from her face. "I know it's hard, Alina, but we can't leave yet. Out there, we're just two children on our own, and it's dangerous, but I promise as soon as I'm old enough, I'll take you away from here." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and trust. "But I don't want to be without you, Marco. I don't want you to leave me behind." "I would never leave you, Alina," he replied, his voice unwavering. "We're in this together. Always." The words seemed to soothe her, and she nodded, her expression softening. Marco knew that his promise was all that kept her going. She clung to the hope that one day they would leave the orphanage and find a life that was theirs alone, a life where they were loved, safe, and free from the pain of loneliness. In the months that followed, Marco did everything he could to make life in the orphanage more bearable for his sister. He shared his stories, played the violin for her, and encouraged her to find small joys in their daily routines. He would tell her about their future, painting a picture of a world where they lived together in a cozy house, perhaps with a garden and a little library filled with books. He would promise her that they would be happy one day, that the darkness of their past would fade into something brighter. And as winter slowly turned to spring, Marco's promise became not just a vow, but a beacon of hope for them both, a light guiding them through the hardships of orphanage life. For Marco, the future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He would do whatever it took to protect Alina and keep his promise. In his heart, he held on to a quiet faith that perhaps someday they would find a place to call home, a place where the past didn't haunt them and where they could build a new life together. A life at the orphanage slowly settled into a routine for Marco and Alina, but as spring arrived, Alina's health began to weaken. Marco noticed the change first. She became pale, her cheeks losing their usual rosy hue, and she often seemed tired, even after a full night's sleep. Despite her brave face, Marco could see her exhaustion, and soon her persistent cough couldn't be ignored. One chilly morning, Alina's cough grew worse. She could barely speak between breaths, her small body racked with shivers. Marco's heart clenched with worry. He hurried to Sofia, his favorite caregiver, pleading with her to check on Alina. "She's not well, Sofia. Please, can you help her?" Marco's voice wavered with desperation. Sofia's face softened as she looked at Marco, sensing his worry. "I'll see what I can do, Marco," she assured him, rushing to Alina's room. Sofia quickly realized that Alina's condition was more serious than she'd initially thought. The head caregiver arranged for a doctor to visit, and when he arrived, he confirmed their worst fears. Alina had developed pneumonia. Due to her weakened state, likely from the stress and emotional strain she had endured at the orphanage, her illness had progressed quickly. "She needs special treatment, possibly even a hospital," the doctor advised, looking over at Sofia with a grave expression. "And soon." But the orphanage had limited resources, and getting Alina the help she needed required funds they simply didn't have. Marco was beside himself with worry. He spent sleepless nights by her bedside, whispering promises of a brighter future and stories of the life they'd share once they left the orphanage. "I'll find a way, Alina," he whispered, determination hardening his voice. "I'll make sure you get better. I promise." But as the days passed and her condition didn't improve, Marco felt more helpless than ever. One evening, as he sat in the empty playroom clutching his violin, a thought struck him. His music had always brought comfort to others. Maybe it could do something more. He decided he would play in the town square to earn the money needed for Alina's treatment. He shared his plan with Sofia, who listened carefully, her eyes shining with admiration and concern. "It's a brave idea, Marco," she said gently. "But are you sure? There will be strangers, many of them, and it won't be easy." "I'll do whatever it takes, Sofia," he replied, resolve solidifying in his eyes. "For Alina." Sofia nodded, touched by his determination. "Then let's make it happen." The following morning, Sofia spoke to the head caregiver, who reluctantly agreed to Marco's plan. Armed with only his violin and a resolve stronger than he'd ever felt, Marco was ready to take on the world for his sister's sake. The morning of his performance, Marco and Sofia took the train into the city. Marco held his violin case tightly, feeling the weight of his responsibility with every step. He could sense Sofia's quiet encouragement beside him, her warm presence a comforting anchor as they walked toward the busy square. When they arrived, Sofia guided Marco to a spot near the fountain, where a bustling crowd moved through the square. She whispered words of encouragement, then stepped back, leaving Marco to his task. Taking a deep breath, he opened his violin case, set out a small empty hat to collect donations, and began to play. The melodies filled the air, drawing the attention of passers-by. People stopped, captivated by the hauntingly beautiful notes that flowed from Marco's violin. His fingers moved gracefully across the strings, and with each note he poured his heart into the music, hoping that someone would hear the desperation woven into his melodies. For nearly 2 hours, Marco played tirelessly. Coins and bills gradually filled Sophia's hat, and with each donation his hope grew. He barely noticed the people passing by or the gathering crowd. He played as if his sister's life depended on it, because in many ways it did. But as he neared the end of his last piece, Marco became aware of a figure standing just beyond the crowd, watching him intently. The man was tall, with dark hair streaked with gray and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see right through him. He wore a somber expression, but something about his gaze felt familiar, though Marco couldn't place why. When the song ended, the man stepped forward, breaking through the crowd. Marco felt a jolt of nervousness as the stranger approached, his expression unreadable. But before Marco could say anything, the man spoke, his voice rich and steady. "Where did you learn to play that melody?" the man asked, his tone serious yet curious. Caught off guard, Marco hesitated. I've just always known it," he stammered, not entirely sure how to explain. "I don't remember where I first heard it." The man's eyes softened, a strange mix of emotions flickering across his face. He seemed to struggle with something before he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You play beautifully," he said, glancing down at the violin. "You remind me of someone I once knew." At that moment, Sophia, noticing Marco's discomfort, hurried over to his side. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but firm, protective of Marco. The man turned to her and nodded, regaining his composure. "Yes, everything is fine," he replied, but his gaze lingered on Marco. "I just recognized something familiar in the boy's playing." With a final nod, the man stepped back, leaving Marco puzzled. There was something about the encounter that left an uneasy feeling in his heart, as if he had missed a crucial moment without even realizing it. As he and Sophia packed up and prepared to leave, Marco's thoughts lingered on the man's words. Who had he reminded the man of, and why had he felt that strange sense of familiarity? On the train ride back to the orphanage, Sophia counted the donations they had gathered, her face lighting up as she tallied the amount. "You did it, Marco," she said warmly. "This will be enough to cover Alina's treatment." But even as relief flooded through him, Marco couldn't shake the feeling that the man's appearance was somehow tied to his past. That evening, he sat by Alina's bedside, holding her hand as she rested. He replayed the strange encounter in his mind, wondering if he had seen the man somewhere before or if the melody itself had somehow connected them. Days later, as Alina began her recovery, the memory of the stranger's face haunted him, a mystery lingering at the edges of his mind. It was as if his past was calling to him through the music, urging him to remember something lost but not forgotten. For now, though, he focused on the present, watching as Alina's health slowly improved with the help of the donations he had worked so hard to earn. He held her hand gently, feeling a surge of relief with every sign of her strength returning. Yet, even in the comfort of her presence, he couldn't silence the questions the encounter had stirred. Who was the man in the square? And why did Marco feel as though he held a key to the answers he'd long sought? The following weeks brought a welcome calm to Marco and Alina's lives. With the funds he had raised, Alina received the treatment she needed, and her recovery brought a sense of peace back to Marco's heart. Despite the hardships, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His violin had saved Alina in a way he never thought possible, and it felt as though the instrument connected him not only to his past, but to a brighter future as well. Just as Marco and Alina were settling back into a comfortable routine, a surprise visitor arrived at the orphanage one sunny afternoon. Mrs. Jenkins, the head of the orphanage, called Marco into her office with an unfamiliar excitement in her eyes. "Marco," she began, her voice gentle, "there's someone here to meet you." Curious and slightly apprehensive, Marco followed Mrs. Jenkins down the narrow hallway to the main entrance. There, waiting with an air of quiet elegance, was the man from the city square, the same one who had watched him play. Marco's heart raced with both excitement and a touch of anxiety. What could he possibly want? The man stepped forward, offering a warm smile. "Hello, Marco," he greeted, his voice calm and reassuring. "My name is Mr. Alvarez. I'd like to speak with you and Mrs. Jenkins, if that's all right." They sat together in Mrs. Jenkins's office, the man's piercing gaze softening as he explained his visit. "I've thought about our encounter ever since I heard you play. I was moved by your music and by your determination to help your sister." Mr. Alvarez paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "I came here today because I'd like to offer you and Alina a new home." Marco's heart skipped a beat. "You mean, you want to adopt us?" he asked, barely able to believe what he was hearing. Mr. Alvarez nodded, smiling gently. "Yes. I know it's sudden, but I believe I can offer you both a safe and caring home. I have the resources, and more importantly, the desire to see you both thrive." Mrs. Jenkins looked between them, a hopeful smile tugging at her lips. She had seen many children come and go, but she could tell this offer was genuine. "This is a wonderful opportunity, Marco," she encouraged softly. "Think of what this could mean for both of you." Marco thought of Alina, of her need for a stable home and a life where they wouldn't have to worry about illness or hunger. He looked up at Mr. Alvarez, his voice steady but hopeful. "I'll go if Alina can come with me." "Of course," Mr. Alvarez assured him, his voice filled with warmth. "You two belong together." A few days later, the paperwork was finalized. Marco and Alina packed their few belongings, each item a reminder of the life they were leaving behind. As they stepped out of the orphanage for the last time, Marco felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had longed for a sense of belonging, and now he was about to find it in a new place, with a man who seemed to understand him on a level even he couldn't fully explain. Their journey to Mr. Alvarez's home was filled with wonder and curiosity. Alina clung to Marco's hand, wide-eyed at the sights and sounds of the bustling city. Soon they arrived at a large, elegant house that was both imposing and welcoming. The home stood on a quiet street, surrounded by tall trees that cast gentle shadows across the manicured lawn. As they stepped through the front door, Mr. Alvarez smiled warmly and led them through the spacious entryway. "Welcome home," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. The siblings looked around in awe. The house was filled with beautiful artwork and musical instruments, from a sleek piano in the living room to a large, stately harp near the fireplace. The atmosphere was warm, and a comforting aroma of fresh-baked bread wafted from the kitchen. As they entered the main room, Marco noticed a girl around his age sitting by the piano. She had chestnut hair, deep gray eyes, and a quiet presence that seemed both guarded and curious. Mr. Alvarez cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "Marco, Alina, this is my daughter, Sophia," he introduced. "She's been very excited to meet you both." Sophia offered a shy smile, her gaze lingering on Marco for a moment before she looked down. Alina, however, wasted no time. She skipped over to Sophia and held out her hand, her face breaking into a hopeful smile. "Hi, I'm Alina. I like your piano," she said enthusiastically. Sophia's face softened as she shook Alina's hand. "Thank you, Alina," she replied, her voice soft but kind. "Maybe one day I can teach you to play." Alina's eyes lit up at the idea, and she nodded eagerly. Marco felt a surge of relief watching his sister connect so quickly with Sophia. He was grateful that they already had a friend in this new place. Mr. Alvarez guided them to their rooms, large, bright spaces that felt cozy and inviting. Marco's room overlooked the garden where vibrant flowers bloomed under the warm sunlight. Alina's room was painted a soft shade of blue, with shelves ready to hold her toys and books. She ran to the window, gazing out with excitement at the new world outside. That evening, they gathered around the dining table for their first family dinner together. Sophia sat quietly next to Marco, occasionally glancing at him as if she wanted to say something but held back. Mr. Alvarez filled the silence with stories of his youth, sharing anecdotes that made them all laugh and feel more at ease. As they finished their meal, Mr. Alvarez looked at Marco thoughtfully. "I have a question for you, Marco," he began. "Would you be interested in playing a duet with Sofia? She's a skilled pianist, and I think the two of you could create something beautiful together." Marco's eyes lit up with excitement. Music had always been a way for him to connect with others, and the idea of sharing it with Sofia was thrilling. "I'd love to," he replied, glancing over at Sofia, who met his gaze with a faint smile. The following day, they began practicing together in the grand living room. Sofia played the piano while Marco accompanied her on his violin. Their melodies blended harmoniously, filling the room with a music that seemed to tell a story of its own. Alina sat nearby, listening with rapt attention, and Mr. Alvarez watched proudly from the doorway, his heart warmed by the sight. Day by day, the bond between Marco, Alina, and Sofia deepened. Marco found that Sofia, though initially reserved, had a gentle spirit and a deep love for music. She gradually opened up, sharing stories of her own, and soon they began spending their free time together, talking, laughing, and exploring their new home. For Alina, life blossomed in the company of Sofia and her father. She had longed for family connections, and now she had them, strong and supportive, filling her days with love and kindness. She no longer felt alone, and Marco could see the light returning to her eyes as she laughed and played in the garden. Their new life was beginning to feel like a true home, and as Marco watched his sister grow happier, he knew they had made the right decision. They had finally found a place where they belonged, and a family that would stand by them through whatever lay ahead. Yet even in the warmth of their new family, Marco couldn't forget the mysteries of his past. Questions lingered, especially about the melody he couldn't quite recall learning, yet knew by heart. But for now, he was content. He had a family, a home, and the promise of a brighter future. And for the first time, he felt that everything might just be all right. The weeks flew by as Marco and Sofia prepared tirelessly for the upcoming music competition. This event, renowned in their city, attracted talented young musicians from across the region. To Marco, the competition was more than just an opportunity to showcase his skills. It was a way to honor the memories he clung to and his love for music, which had been his constant companion through life's hardships. The Alvarez household buzzed with excitement. Mr. Alvarez had arranged everything for the competition day, from practice schedules to arranging outfits for Marco and Sofia to perform in. He even took time off work to personally help them with their last few rehearsals, his face beaming with pride each time they played. As the competition day drew near, Marco could sense Sofia growing tense. Though they practiced together daily, he noticed the slight tremble in her hands and the way her fingers hesitated over the keys. He understood her anxiety. This competition meant just as much to her as it did to him, possibly even more. It was a chance for her to prove herself, not only to the judges, but to her father and herself. The night before the event, Marco found Sofia in the garden, sitting quietly by the pond where they often relaxed after practice. The evening sky was a soft gradient of pinks and purples, casting a peaceful glow over the garden. "Hey, are you all right?" Marco asked as he sat beside her. Sofia looked down, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "I'm just nervous. What if I make a mistake? What if I ruin it for both of us?" Marco placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You won't. I've seen how hard you've worked, Sofia. We're going to do this together, and even if something goes wrong, we'll keep going. We're a team, right?" A small smile broke through her worried expression. "Yeah, a team," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Early the next morning, they arrived at the concert hall. The grand venue was filled with contestants, their families, and judges with discerning eyes. Marco felt his heartbeat quicken as they waited for their turn backstage, but he focused on the music, letting it calm his nerves. When their names were finally announced, Marco took Sofia's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. They stepped onto the stage, and Marco felt an overwhelming sense of calm as he spotted Mr. Alvarez and Alina in the audience, their faces filled with encouragement. They began to play, their notes weaving together like an intricate tapestry. Sophia's fingers glided over the piano keys, each note resonating with precision and grace. Marco's violin followed, harmonizing in a way that felt like second nature. The audience was captivated, and for a brief, beautiful moment, Marco felt as if they were the only two people in the room. However, as they reached the final crescendo, Sophia stumbled over a note. Marco saw the panic flicker in her eyes. Without hesitation, he picked up the melody, guiding her back on track, his own notes strong and steady. She caught his rhythm, her confidence slowly returning as they brought the piece to a breathtaking conclusion. The audience erupted in applause, and Marco and Sophia shared a smile, both relieved and exhilarated. As they left the stage, Sophia whispered, "Thank you for helping me," her voice filled with gratitude. Marco simply nodded, knowing that this was the bond they had built through music, a trust that went beyond words. The weeks after the competition were filled with joy and relief. The judges awarded Marco and Sophia second place, a victory that brought pride to the entire Alvarez family. Mr. Alvarez celebrated by treating them to dinner at their favorite restaurant, and Alina couldn't stop talking about how incredible they'd sounded on stage. Yet despite the happiness surrounding him, Marco felt a restlessness in his heart. The competition had stirred memories and emotions that he couldn't quite place. One evening, as he sat alone with his violin, he began to play the melody he'd always known, the one he had played in the city square before meeting Mr. Alvarez. Each note seemed to whisper secrets he longed to remember. As he played, he became so absorbed that he didn't hear Mr. Alvarez enter the room. When he finally looked up, he saw his adoptive father standing by the doorway, a thoughtful expression on his face. "That melody," Mr. Alvarez said softly, "it's one I haven't heard in years." Marco put down his violin, looking at Mr. Alvarez with a mixture of surprise and hope. "Do you know it?" Mr. Alvarez nodded, his eyes reflecting both sadness and nostalgia. "Yes, I taught it to someone very dear to me once, someone who was also an incredibly talented violinist. She was your mother, Marco." Marco felt his breath catch. He had always sensed there was something more to his connection with Mr. Alvarez, but he hadn't dared to ask, fearing the answer might disrupt the life he had come to cherish. "Your mother was my student and my close friend. I recognized you at the city square, not just from the melody, but because you reminded me of her in so many ways." Mr. Alvarez's voice faltered, and he continued, "After she passed, I searched everywhere for you and Alina, but I couldn't find you. I thought I'd lost both of you forever until I heard you play again at the train station. It was like hearing her all over again." Marco sat in stunned silence, the weight of Mr. Alvarez's words sinking in. His mother, the woman he barely remembered, had been this close to him all along, through the music and the man who had taken him and Alina in. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Marco asked, his voice thick with emotion. Mr. Alvarez sighed, his gaze distant. "At first I wasn't sure if it was you, and even when I was, I didn't want to burden you with memories that might be too painful. I wanted you to find happiness here without the weight of the past, but now, seeing you play, I know it's time you understood where you came from." A wave of emotions washed over Marco. Grief for the mother he'd lost, gratitude for Mr. Alvarez's compassion, and a newfound determination to honor the memory of the woman who had passed on her love for music to him. Mr. Alvarez handed him a small photo, one he had kept close for years. It was a picture of a young woman with strikingly familiar features, holding a violin with a serene smile. She looked just like Marco had imagined, and he felt a pang of both sorrow and joy. "Thank you," Marco whispered, clutching the photo tightly. "Thank you for telling me. I feel like I finally know who I am." Mr. Alvarez placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember, Marco, you're not alone in this journey. I'm here, and so is Sophia and Alina. We're your family, and we'll support you every step of the way." In the days that followed, Marco shared his newfound understanding with Alina and Sophia. Alina, although young, listened with wide, curious eyes, her small hand gripping Marco's as he spoke. Sophia sat quietly, her gaze filled with empathy and warmth. Through this revelation, Marco felt his bond with his family grow even stronger. The Alvarez home was no longer just a safe haven. It was the place where he had found not only shelter but also a deeper connection to his past and a clear path forward. And as he looked toward the future, Marco knew he was ready to carry on the legacy of his mother's music, honoring her memory while creating his own story in the world she had loved so much. The days following Marco's discovery were a mix of joy, grief, and deep reflection. The revelation about his mother and Mr. Alvarez's history with her weighed heavily on his heart. But it also brought a sense of peace he hadn't known he was missing. He now understood why he had felt such an unexplainable bond with Mr. Alvarez and why music was so ingrained in him. It was a bridge connecting him to his mother and the love she had poured into every note she played. Sophia, his adoptive sister, proved to be a pillar of support. She listened intently as Marco shared the details of his journey, from the orphanage to the competition, and the moment Mr. Alvarez had opened up about his mother. Though she had always been quiet and reserved, Sophia was gentle and understanding, helping Marco heal in ways he hadn't anticipated. Marco also began to spend more time with Alina, sharing stories about their parents even if his memories were few. Alina would listen with wide eyes, her hand in his, finding comfort in the idea of their mother watching over them. It was clear that both siblings found strength in each other and their bond grew deeper, shaped by this shared history they had only begun to understand. In the peaceful moments that followed, Marco and Mr. Alvarez often played music together, their melodies weaving through the house, blending into something that transcended notes and harmonies. Each session was a step toward healing, a chance to express what words could not convey. One rainy afternoon, as Marco was helping Mr. Alvarez sort through old sheet music, they came across a small, weathered journal tucked between the pages. Mr. Alvarez held it out to him, his expression a mixture of surprise and nostalgia. "This was your mother's," he said softly. "I hadn't seen it in years." Marco took the journal reverently, running his fingers over its worn leather cover. As he opened it, he was transported into the thoughts and dreams of the woman he hardly remembered. The pages were filled with sketches, music notes, and small written thoughts, a snapshot of her life before she had become his mother. Reading her words, Marco learned about her hopes and aspirations, her love for music, and her passion for life. Each page brought him closer to understanding the woman she had been, beyond the fragments of memory and the melancholy that had surrounded his recollection of her. Towards the back of the journal, he found a passage she had written shortly after he was born. "My greatest hope is that Marco grows up knowing love, courage, and the importance of kindness. I want him to hear the world's music and make it his own, to feel joy even in hardship." The words resonated deeply with Marco. He realized he had fulfilled her hope for him in ways she might never have imagined. He had found love, family, and purpose, and he was beginning to understand that his life was not a series of disconnected events but a continuous journey, shaped by those who loved him, both present and past. With a newfound understanding of his past, Marco embraced life at the Alvarez household with a renewed sense of purpose. He poured himself into his music studies, often practicing alongside Sophia and sometimes teaching Alina, who was beginning to show an interest in playing the violin. Mr. Alvarez, moved by Marco's dedication, arranged for him to meet with a prominent violin instructor, someone who could guide him as he pursued his passion further. As he attended lessons and improved his skill, Marco found himself dreaming of a future where he could share his music with others. He envisioned performing on grand stages, using his music not only as a career, but as a tribute to his mother's memory. As the months passed, life in the Alvarez home grew warmer and more filled with laughter. The family shared meals, played board games, and celebrated small milestones together. Alina, ever curious, peppered her siblings with questions about their parents, their childhood, and the music that filled the house. The Alvarez family had become a true family, bound by love, loyalty, and a shared history that only strengthened over time. Sophia, too, blossomed during this time, finding comfort in her bond with Marco. She no longer carried the same apprehension she once had, feeling secure and proud of the music they created together. Their relationship became one of mutual respect and encouragement, each of them supporting the other as they navigated the challenges and joys of growing up. Reminds us that no matter where we come from or what we've lost, life has a way of bringing us exactly where we're meant to be. Through kindness, connection, and courage, we build our own families and carry forward legacies that live on in the lives we touch. If Marco's story inspired you, please press subscribe. Join us for more tales of hope and resilience, and let's continue exploring the stories that remind us all of the strength within each of us. Thank you for being here, and stay tuned for more stories that warm the heart and lift the spirit.